Okay, so as I said, we are in Exodus. We're gonna start in chapter 4, and we got a lot to get through tonight. But I wanted to call out two specific points that are at the end of chapter 3. Verse 19 of Exodus 3. You recall, we're still. What's the location in chapter 3 and going into chapter 4? What's going on at this point? Burning bush, right. Burning bush. And we're still going to be there when we jump into chapter 4. But at the very end of chapter 3, verse 19, God says, "But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand." It's interesting, God's already setting the stage with Moses. He hasn't told him what he's going to ask him to do yet, but he's already telling him, hey, I'm going to send you, but it's not going to work. It's going to come down to me compelling him. And we're going to read about what he does. And then in verse 21, it says, "I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians." Why is that important? What do they end up doing with all of that? Because they do plunder the Egyptians. Yeah, they end up building the tabernacle. There's a call. I mean, we're not giving away any secret. We know how this ends. They're going to be calling for all of this to the point later on that Moses is going to have to say, "Stop, that's enough. We've got all that we need." So when God says they will plunder the Egyptians, that's exactly what they do. And the Egyptians are only happy to give it to them. We're jumping all over the place. But again, that's it. So God calls that out very specifically here at the end of chapter 3. So let's jump into chapter 4. Just a heads up here. Next week we will not be meeting. We will have our gospel meeting next Wednesday. The following Wednesday we're going to be looking at chapters 7 through 10, and I'll highlight this again at the end of class. So I want to add a little bit of context here as we get started. We talked briefly, I heard it come up, how long were the people here? How long were they in Egypt? Well, a couple things I want to share with you. Chapter 12, and that is verse 40. It says, "The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." Sounds pretty specific and definitive, doesn't it? But it's not, actually. There's another side to this. So Galatians 3, this is Paul writing to the Galatians. "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring." Jumping down into verse 17, "This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void." There is the thought also that 430 years actually begins with Abraham, not necessarily with Jacob coming into Egypt. And if that's the case, you're looking more at a timeline of a little over 200 years that the Israelites were in Egypt as we know it. And not the whole time being persecuted. The first 90 years or so, they dwelt they got along very well with the Egyptian Pharaoh at the time. So I would say, this is neither here nor there, right? But typically we read Exodus 12, which seems very clear. But there's also, one of the other things that I read too was that Paul, so in Galatians 3, Paul is probably referring to the Septuagint version of Exodus 12. In the Septuagint, it says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and their fathers, which they sojourned in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt, was 430 years. Hear the difference? In Canaan and Egypt, which would have been where Abraham was prior to that. So, again, not a huge discrepancy. It's not going to change my faith one bit or another, but it's interesting when you think about that. So it wasn't, I'm trying to give you some idea of how long the people were actually there. Another thing I wanted to show really quickly, I like maps. Those of you who don't, sorry, they'll pop up again. We'll get into it a little bit more as we start the journey, but I just wanted to show. So you see Lower Egypt up there in the top left-hand corner. See an area called Goshen. It's a little bit harder to see some of the cities of Ramses and Pithom that I think we read in chapter 2. Those are the store cities that the Egyptians or the Israelites were made to build. That's the area where we're going to start this journey. And really, this is just meant to show on the right side, modern day. So this is still part of Egypt in that Sinai Peninsula. And then we're going to talk about tonight Midian. Midian is modern day Saudi Arabia up into Jordan. And there's a couple different things here. There's a couple different ideas of where Mount Sinai actually is. The traditional route, you kind of see that red line going down into the Sinai Peninsula down there. There's one labeled Mount Sinai. There's also some thoughts potentially that it was on the other side over in the Midian area. But either way, this is the area that we're talking about tonight when we talk about Midian. We're talking about, actually, it's going to be kind of both sides of that Gulf of Aqaba that exists right there is Midian. And I thought this might be helpful, too, to understand when we talk about Moses. So we read of his birth in Exodus chapter 2. Obviously, he was 0. Then we see in Acts 7. So anybody know what's happening in Acts 7, by the way? Yeah, Stephen is retelling, right. He's telling the history of the Old Testament, and he talks specifically about Moses. So there's a little bit more detail there as well. He talks about, it says in verse 20, Acts 7:23, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. So that's the part we talked about last week where he intervened on behalf of one of his brethren, killed an Egyptian, and then he leaves. He was 40 years old at that point. The other thing I thought that was interesting there is that Acts 7 says, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was mighty in his words and his deeds. He'd had extensive training and being brought up in education in Egypt to this point. 40 years, he flees into Midian. We read in Exodus 7 and again in Acts 30 that he's actually 80 years when he returns. Exodus 7:7, now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Sometimes don't think about that. You think of Moses as kind of a younger man, at least in my mind, coming back to lead the people. 80 years old at this point. So he'd spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian. Then he's going to go get the people, and they're going to go into the wilderness. And it's going to roughly take us another 40 years. As Deuteronomy 34:7 says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. Sounds like something that should be on a headstone, right? Eyes undimmed and vigor unabated. So that's the timeline of Moses. 120 years old gives you some idea of what was kind of the events that are happening at that point. All right, so let's get into chapter 4. We tend to think of chapter 4, again, he's still at the burning bush, talking to God. We tend to think of this section as the part where Moses makes all of his excuses. On the surface, he says, they will not believe me. On the surface, why could this be a legitimate concern? Again, it's easy to say Moses just keeps making excuse after excuse after excuse. But he says, they will not believe me. Why could that be legitimate? Matt? Okay, they already didn't believe him once. And that was a while ago, right? 40 years ago. Do they know they know Moses? That's a good point. So if they knew him, if he comes back after 40 years and there are people that still remember him and recognize him, they remember him as the Pharaoh's daughter's son, raised, trained, taught in Egyptian custom. Did I hear something over here? They didn't. They didn't know then. So that's his memory too. I mean, that's the other thing. This is Moses' last remembrance, is trying to intervene, and his own people saying, "What are you doing? Why'd you do that?" So I think it could be. And the other thing I thought of too is, at this point with the Israelites, is the Lord appearing? Is that a common occurrence for them at this point? No. And Moses is going to come and say, I've spoken with God. Here's what's going to happen. That's a good point. That's a good point. They might not even know who the Lord that Moses is referring. They might not know Moses, and they might not know the God that he's referring to. So it's very much a legitimate concern, I think, for Moses. They're not going to believe me. God gives him 3 signs in chapter 4. That, okay, they're not going to believe you. I can help with that. So he gives 3 signs. What's the first sign? The staff. What about the staff, Darren? Okay. God says, I love it, the Bible. Remember who wrote Exodus? Moses, guided by the Holy Spirit. So when you read through this, think of that. There's just I think it says, God said to Moses, what's that in your hand? And Moses said, a staff. And it's like, tells him what to do. And he throws it down, it becomes a serpent, picks it back up, becomes a staff again. What's the next sign? Yeah. Kind of creepy, right? Put his hand inside of some kind of covering, takes it out, and it's leprous. Puts it back in, and it's back to normal. Yeah, kind of creepy. And then he says, finally, if those 2 don't work, while you're there, you can go do what? Get some water out of the Nile. When you pour it out, it will come out as blood. A little bit of foreshadowing there, right? So he gives him 3 signs to help Moses, or for Moses to help Pharaoh understand? Who do you think it benefited more? Yeah. Oh, that's right. You're exactly right. It wasn't necessarily for Pharaoh initially, it was for the people. Right. But I think for Moses too, it was helpful for him to say, okay, I've got some things I can use here. So he says, they will not believe me. God provides for that. So he says, well, I am not an eloquent speaker. Verse 11 of chapter 4, verse 11 says, then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Does that remind you of anywhere else in the Bible? You're not allowed to say that, Corey, because you've been in this class before. Corey said Job, and that was what I thought of too. What's the reference in Job? Remember, Job's kind of being a little testy there. God, in chapter 38, God says, well, where were you when I did? And he goes through this list of laying the foundations of the world. Where were you, Job, when I did all these things? It's God reminding, I can do whatever I want, and you're small. You were not there. Moses says, I can't speak well. God says, I made your mouth. I can make you mute, deaf, blind, all of that. Corey talked about last week, God, I am who I am. And as this kind of back and forth of, I'm not an eloquent speaker, I'm just not going to be able to do what you need me to do. I think Moses really completely misses the message of God's name and power. I am is all that we need in every circumstance of life, and it's foolish for us to argue, well, I am not. I am who I am what I am, I will be what I will be. God provides. If God can accomplish the previous three signs, he can certainly enable Moses to speak his word with power. And Moses was making the mistake of looking at himself rather than to God. He was thinking about what he could or couldn't do rather than what God could do for him. Yeah. That section in Acts 7 when Stephen's talking again, he specifically says because of his training, he was mighty in his words and his deeds. So at some point, he was pretty accomplished. So I really think it's, again, I mentioned this earlier too, but God tells him that Pharaoh isn't going to listen anyway unless he's compelled by God's mighty hand. God tells him, I need you to do these things. I need you to deliver this message. Oh, by the way, he's not going to listen. So it should take some of the pressure off, I would think. You're having to convince someone of something and then be told, don't worry, you're not going to be able to do it, but I'm going to take care of it. Should take some of the pressure off, at least I would think so. What are your thoughts on how Moses approached this situation? Is this Moses being stubborn here? Or is it offering true humility? Or neither? Like, what are your thoughts, Zach? Afraid? Coming up with reasons not to because he's afraid? Because again, we know how we talked about how he left things, right? Well, yeah. Good point too. He's talking to God. We know 40 years ago he felt perfectly adequate to face an enemy and act on behalf of the people. But now he's backing off and professing to be worthless, basically. So I think there could be some fear here. Any other thoughts? He had completely changed where he. I think when I think back to that timeline, I think it's important to note the chunks of his life, and because they were completely different. They were completely, and so for him to go back, what was he doing in Midian for 40 years? What? Herding sheep, raising a family. You know, he had a couple sons, and now he's being asked to go back into a place that probably didn't have great memories for him. I would suggest too that humility isn't necessarily thinking poorly of ourselves, right? That's not really humility. It's simply not thinking of ourselves at all, but making God everything. And Moses, once he comes to true humility, thinks only of God and God's glory, not his own inadequacies or successes or failures. He eventually becomes exactly who God needs him to be. because he was focusing on himself rather, yes, than thinking about what God could do for him. Yeah. And then the third thing he says is someone else can do it better. He, over in verse 10, so in verse 10, but Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent." Then in verse 13, after God told him, "No, I made your mouth, we can take care of that." In verse 13, he says, "O my Lord, please send someone else." And then it says God got angry. I keep hearing this, "Oh my Lord, and it reminds me of Luke 6:46, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I tell you?" That's how God was feeling here. You're calling me Lord, God, and you're not trusting me to do what I'm asking you to do. The other thing here that's interesting is sometimes an angry God can actually give us what we want, even if it's not the best thing for us in the moment. Can you think of examples in Old Testament history when that was the case? Say that again. The Israelites wanting a king, finally said, okay, didn't want to do it, but okay, you got it. Deal with it now. Yeah. I think there's even later here in the wilderness example of regarding the quail and just frustration God has with the people. So was Aaron a helper or a problem for Moses? So that's the response, is like, I can't speak. Okay, well, I can get somebody to speak for you. Yeah. When was it problematic? The golden calf. I think there's another reference in Numbers when Moses marries a Cushite woman, and Miriam and Aaron speak out against him, and it causes trouble in the camp because they're asking, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us? And God says, no, Moses is my chosen one here. There are some examples of Aaron being a bit of, I wouldn't call a thorn in the side, but not the best helper you would expect him to be. But how does Aaron help Moses? Not just in this instance with Pharaoh, but beyond that. Yeah, he ministers along with Moses and became the founder of the priesthood in Israel. We know what God says about this idea of having two, a pair. Disciples were sent in pairs. Ecclesiastes 4:9, two are better than one. They fall, one will lift up his fellow. There was value to that, having that right-hand man, as you said, that go-to person. It would be interesting what that would have looked like had Moses not petitioned for, that he couldn't speak. What would that have looked like going forward? No, he didn't. He's like, okay, well, at least from what we read, it's just Moses relays to him everything God told him. And Aaron's like, okay. You need somebody like that too, right? That you just tell them what needs to be done and then. Okay, so we wrap up chapter 4 here. I wanted to point out 5 things that I see anyway that feel like God really encouraging Moses. You see this, God interceding on Moses' behalf from the moment he was born, and you'll see several instances throughout. And at this time, it seems like Moses really needs some level of encouragement. Can you imagine having to pack up everything you have after 40 years? The place you met your spouse, where you raised your children, and then all of a sudden you're being asked, we're picking up. It's not even moving, really. They don't know where they're going, quite honestly, at this point. Moses is just being told, I have a job for you, Moses. So that needs some encouragement, I think. And so a few things that are worth noting. We see his father-in-law giving a blessing. He asks specifically to Jethro in verse 18, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see if they are still alive. He says, go in peace. We see the promise of God being offered. Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So that's another key point to know that tells us that the Pharaoh at the time most likely was dead. So we would be having another Pharaoh, and we know how that's going to end as well. So this is a different Pharaoh in place. So that would be, I think that would help him a little bit, feel a little bit better. People that wanted you dead are no longer still there. Zipporah's obedience. We need to dive into this a little bit. Maylou brought this. She's like, "Are we going to talk about this?" So this is really interesting. Take a look in 24, verse 24, because it just kind of comes out of nowhere. It's you're reading, and then you're like, "Whoa, what? God wanted to kill Moses?" Let's read this, chapter 4, verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. So, a lodging place along the way. This is God and Moses. The Lord met Moses, and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. What's going on here? Besides the circumcision. I mean, what are the circumstances going on here? So this most likely would have been Moses' second son. I think it's Eliezer. Gershom was his first son. This would have been the second. Why is this it says God sought to put him to death as he was on his way to do what God asked him to do. What's the circumstances here? Either way, you're right. It does seem that this was something that Moses knew needed to be done, and he had failed to do it. Even if others didn't know, God knows. God is sending him. He's going to bring in the law. We can't have Moses skirting around things that he knows he needs to do as he begins this journey. So Moses did. Maybe it would cut into his credibility. Yes. And so to your point, regardless of why it didn't happen when it should have happened, God knew what needed to be done. He wasn't going to let Moses skirt by on this. I don't know if this is an example of Moses. You need to make sure you're ruling your own house well. You pointed to the fact of maybe this was something that Zipporah didn't want to do early on. Maybe that's why he didn't do it. I don't know. But it had to be done. And it's weird how it's just kind of placed in there. Yeah. And some of that, when you read through Exodus 2, that's the thing you'll see is there are moments where it doesn't flow in a perfect order, or things happen out of sequence sometimes. You have to kind of go back and say, oh, this actually happened here. So I don't know, but it does say along the way this had to be addressed. Okay, and then Aaron's arrival. Again, we reference this. Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness and meet Moses. So he went and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words which he had to speak and all the signs which he had commanded him to do. I think it also says that Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and he did the signs in the sight of the people. So Aaron was able to do these signs as well. He wasn't just a mouthpiece. He was stepping in and doing these signs on behalf of Moses, it sounds like as well. So all this to say, Moses was being encouraged before he went into this, what he was being asked to do. All right, so we get into chapter 5, and we get to Egypt. And I want to look at this from a couple different perspectives. I want to look at Pharaoh, I want to look at the people, the Israelites, look at Moses, and look at God, and kind of the reactions, the multiple reactions that happen here. So we read right away that Moses and Aaron went to the Pharaoh, and they say right off the bat, thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. So that's the first request. Let them go so they can go to a feast. It doesn't say let them go completely. Let them go, they may hold a feast. I found it interesting that they were able to get an audience with Pharaoh. Maybe it's because, I don't even know why, but they could just kind of walk up and get this audience. Two men stand before the ruler of one of the greatest kingdoms of the ancient world, sent by God to inform Pharaoh that if he didn't let the people go, Jehovah would declare war on him. Let my people go, or else. And Pharaoh said, Why should I obey your Lord? I don't know him. Does that seem reasonable? He didn't know him. And then the next one is, why should I have them stop working? They're making bricks for me. Why should I stop them? If it's going to take you 3 days to go to this wilderness, into the wilderness for this feast, and 3 days back, that's 6 days. Why would I want them to stop working? These actually, they don't sound like ridiculous questions, quite honestly. And so then the Hebrews, Moses and Aaron make this request to Pharaoh, and he rejects them. Then what does Pharaoh do? What's his next course of action? He increases their work. Yeah. He makes it harder on them. To the point where the Hebrews ask, why do you treat your servants like this? Why are you doing this to us? Because he says, find your own straw for your bricks. But you still have the same deadline. And they don't know where this is coming from. They're like, why are you treating us like this? How does Pharaoh spin this? What's his response when they ask, why are you treating us like this? Yeah. Apparently, according to Moses and Aaron, you have enough time to go out to this feast. You've got plenty of time. So he kind of tries to put it back on Aaron and Moses. So then the Hebrews' response to Moses, why have you made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh? Why have you brought this upon us? So first they question Pharaoh, and then they turn on Moses. Why have you done this to us? Moses' response. Then who does Moses turn to? He turns to God. He turns to God in verse 22. "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me?" His faith is already crushed. One rejection, and he's already crushed. Even though God told him Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. Zach? We already knew how Pharaoh's going to respond. I think there's something to that. This is helping Moses grow to become the leader that he's going to need to be. Faith for the people to know, back to the point of how well did they even know God at this point? Them being able to see the upcoming plagues and how they are protected by God during that. I think there's a lot of value for them as well. I think that's a good point. So Moses is distraught. Why did you send me? Why did you do this to the people? And he even, verse 23, "For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you've not delivered your people at all." So after one confrontation, Moses is throwing up his hands. And so then we see God, and we see God's response in chapter 6. I want to read this quote over here on the right-hand side. "All the kings of the earth before God are as grasshoppers. They are nothing and less than nothing. Both their love and their hatred is to be despised. The wrath of the great King of kings is as much more terrible than theirs, as his majesty is greater." That is Jonathan Edwards in his famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." You can see it's starting to ring true here. God is going to say, now you're going to see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. Chapter 6, he starts off, "For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." God's response in chapter 6 is pretty strong. I wanted to read this. We see the phrase, "I am the Lord," at least 4 times. Starting in verse 2, God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord." And he talks about, appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then he starts in verse 6 and says, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you out into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. I will give it to you for possession. I am the Lord." So war has been declared. We tried it. Pharaoh refused. Moses cried a little bit. And now God's like, okay, we're going to do this. And what is the charge that God gives to Moses and Aaron in chapter 6? He even says it specifically. I give you this charge. It says to bring the people out of Israel, bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, verse 13. This is your responsibility now. This is what I'm going to have you do. You're going to bring my people out of Egypt. God says, I told you what was going to happen. Now watch. Yeah. Any other comments, thoughts? Because we're going to get to the plagues in a couple weeks. And that's when it gets really interesting. It's a little surprising, isn't it? Yeah. Anything else? Any other comments? The comment was Pharaoh asking, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? He's going to get an answer to that question pretty quickly. That's a good point. All right. So if you have not read through Exodus in its entirety, I would encourage it, because there's so much at the end that as you're going through in the beginning, you're like, oh yeah, we talked about that. That's coming. That's really helpful to make the connections as you go back and break it up chapter by chapter. So in 2 weeks, we're going to look at chapter 7 through 10. We're going to get into the plagues. And that's it. Thank you so much for your attention.